By way of background, my name is Gregory Perdon. I've been a fund manager for about 26 years. I've worked at firms such as Oppenheimer and Merrill Lynch in the States. I served as co-chief investment officer and head of investment research at Arbuthnot, the London-listed bank, for about 12 years. And I just joined McInroy Wood, a Scottish fund manager. And I'm delighted to be there. I'm a board member and also a fund manager. And I'm very excited to be here with you today. Right, so my objective today is to talk to you about the mega trends which are impacting global markets. My aim is to give you a lens through which you can look, view, and then judge for yourself on one aspect of the global economy. But before we start, rules of the road, because I like rules. No PowerPoint, no jargon. We're going to keep it short and sharp and under 22 minutes. For the simple reason that the neuroscientists argue that it's actually difficult to pay attention for more than 22 minutes. And I like to listen to the science. So we're going to start today, just for background. I've given hundreds of these talks over the years, and they all are a bit different, but the context is always very similar, in that I try to avoid the headlines of the day-to-day newspapers and focus rather on the large structural trends which are impacting global companies, large and small, around the world. So we're going to step away together from the volatility of the daily headlines and focus rather on turning east to try to unpack one of the biggest questions facing policymakers, global companies, their advisors, and global investors today. Namely, what is the outlook for China? Has it peaked? Has it paused? Or is it about to enter into a deflationary cycle? Now, this particular question is rather ambitious for a 22-minute talk for the simple reason that China is so large, so complex. There's 4.4 billion people there. But it's increasingly difficult to create the analysis just because it's becoming more and more opaque to outside investors as it turns, sadly, inwards. So, just for context, why am I asking this question today? Well, for the simple reason that when I started my career back in the early 90s, China didn't matter from an investment perspective. What was front of mind were things like long-term capital management, Russia defaulting on its sovereign debt, and the currency crisis in Asia. China wasn't even on the docket. And boy, has that changed today. You cannot be a multinational today. You cannot be an advisor to a multinational today. You can't be an international global investor today without having a view on the trajectory for China. No view on China, at your own peril. So the next question becomes, how are we going to go about tackling that question? How are we going to go about approaching it? And of course, there's many ways of doing it. My way, my preferred method, is by creating a model. And the first step in creating that model is to find a comparable. And that's the first exercise we're going to go through today as a group. Finding comparables so that we can there in turn create a baseline, and that baseline will then in turn power our analysis. So come and join me as we cycle back through history to try to identify a country in Asia which at some point in the past resembled China today. And I'll give you a couple of hints. I'm looking for a nation which underwent a multi-decade economic boom, spurred on by innovation and manufacturing, that was home to some of the largest banks in the world at the time, that benefited from a huge centralized and powerful government, and of course benefited from a huge trade surplus. I think you all know which country to whom I'm referring. Of course, it's Japan. Today, in today's talk, we cycle back to Japan during the 1980s, at the height of the Asian miracle, a period when Japanese companies were the envy of companies around the world, when Japan was annualizing 6.5% annualized growth, while rest of world was between 3 and 3.5. And so the first question we need to ask ourselves is, what powered that economic growth? Well, there are lots of factors. The three that come to mind are ultra-low interest rates, excess lending, and of course, my favorite, irrational exuberance. And these were the magical ingredients which fueled one of the greatest rallies in stock markets and property markets in modern period. To give you some perspective, it was estimated back then that the grounds upon which the Emperor's Palace in central Tokyo was valued at more than all the land in the entire state of California combined. And of course, we all know what happened next. Bank of Japan came in and aggressively raised interest rates, bringing an end to one of the greatest rallies of all times. They rose interest rates from 2.5% to 6% in a short period of 15 months. In essence, taking the champagne bucket, the punch bowl, and all the sake glasses away simultaneously. Now, this set the stage for huge deleveraging and a decline in asset prices, which was so significant. It then drove consumers, households, and corporates to buy less goods. This then translated into a period of 20 years of economic stagnation, otherwise referred to as the lost decade. Let me just repeat that. Huge deleveraging, driving households and corporates to consume less, resulting in a 20-year period of economic stagnation, a period otherwise referred to as the lost decade. Now, I'd just like you to imagine for 1 second what it would be like if 1.4 billion people today decided to stagnate economically. That would impact every single person in this room and all the businesses we advise. So part of the exercise today is we're going to try to decide whether we should moderate upwards or moderate downwards the probability of that economic stagnation. That's my role today. It's not necessarily to tell you what I think is going to happen, it's to equip you with the information so that you can create your own model, your own forecast, based on your own view. And I'm going to do that by providing some data, because I'm a data guy, I'm a fund manager, I like the numbers. So let's start with debt, demographic, and trade. So we're comparing Japan back in the 80s and 90s to China today. That's the exercise. And we'll start with debt. So the first number we're going to look at is non-financial credit to GDP ratio of 297%. That was the number back in Japan in the early 1990s, and that's the exact same number in China today. In terms of demographic, back in Japan in the early 90s, 12.6% of the population was over 65. The number today in China is 12.7%. Let's talk about trade for a second. Of course, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it often rhymes. You'll remember that there were huge trade surpluses between Japan and the US, which led to the Plaza Accord in 1985, not too dissimilar to what we saw in the terms of the trade wars between the US and China in 2018. But perhaps China's actually in a worse position today than back in Japan. And what evidence could I point to, could I uncover, could I present to you to potentially support that claim? Let's look at some of the numbers. Again, debt, demographics. So just in terms of debt, if you gross up local debt and government debt in China today, it's about 95% debt to GDP ratio, which is elevated. You compare that back to Japan in the early 90s, the number was 61. That's just one way of looking at it. In terms of demographic, China actually has begun its population to decline last year, whereas in Japan, it was only in 2008 where the Japanese population started to decline. In addition, if you look at the advantage Japan sat in early 1990s, 91 for example, interest rates were at 8%. They had a huge ability to ease financial conditions, so they lowered interest rates down to 2.5%. If you compare that, like for like, China already has ultra-low interest rates. The 7-day repo rate, just as a proxy, is currently 1.9%. So China actually doesn't have a lot of ammunition to ease financial conditions. So based on those numbers, you might want to moderate upwards the probability that China decides to stagnate going forwards. Or maybe not. Let me present you some other arguments. and some other data points so that you can in turn continue to formulate your mental model. Let's look again at the debt. The concentration or composition of the debt is very different. In Japan, it was very well spread out across sectors and industries, whereas in China today, it's very concentrated amongst SOEs, local government, and the like, property, for example. In addition, if you try to compare what's happening in the housing market between Japan back then and China today, we saw significant house price declines in Japan, which of course brought up LTVs. And today in China, we've seen some price weakness, but what we're really seeing is volume declines. And China can probably more control that. In terms of housing affordability, another way, another matrix to look through this, or a lens to look through which we can make a judgment. It's true, housing affordability in places like Beijing and Shanghai are very unaffordable. But if you go down closer to Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities, they're actually much more affordable. And of course, I haven't even mentioned one of the biggest arguments in support that China can actually sidestep the possible stagnation. And that's, of course, pulling the lever of urbanization. Well-known research house CLSA estimates that the urbanization ratio in China is about 66%. Comp that against Japan back in the early 90s, it was about 77%. And apparently the 66% actually underestimates. In addition, China benefits from a huge untapped domestic market, which Japan did not. In addition, China is leaders in industries which will probably continue to do well, such as EVs and alike. And I haven't mentioned the two strongest arguments if you want to moderate down the probability of stagnation, which is the fact that China benefits from a closed capital account. So even if you try to take the money out, it's much more difficult. And finally, the nail in the coffin is that President Xi presides over a command and control economy. In other words, what Xi wants, Xi gets. That's very powerful. So the next question becomes, well, what can the Chinese government do to reduce the probability of stagnation, to sidestep the possibility of a lost decade? And the reality is they have a lot of tools in their toolbox. So you're probably thinking, hang on a second, this is a money manager from McInroy Wood based in the outskirts of Edinburgh. Is he really going to start giving advice to the Chinese government? Of course not. All I'm trying to achieve is to give you the clues to figure out what to look for. If you see any of the following policy announcements being made, you can moderate downwards the probability of stagnation. If you don't see any of these policy announcements being made, you can probably moderate up. Thereby, you can be the judge. So a couple of ideas. Number one, youth unemployment in China has spiked. So much so, the government has stopped publishing the rate. Never a good sign. The government easily can target policies such as reducing the NI, the national insurance rate, to spur on employment amongst the youth. Point number two. So Richard Koo, well-known Nomura economist, he coined the term the balance sheet recession, which was to describe what happened in Japan in the early 90s. The government can easily launch targeted programs to help spur on consumption, especially with the well-off, with voucher issuance that's expired. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, in China, it's different there. You only spend $1 earned. And of course, your criticism would be correct. However, that policy dovetails in well with President Xi's policies towards wealth redistribution. So maybe it's not that far off. In addition, other policies that could potentially be tools in the toolbox include yuan devaluation. Now, I know that could be potentially unpopular with the PBOC, but the reality is that that could help spur exports. And the reality, if you want to comp it again to Japan today, for the past 2 years, the Japanese yen has fallen out of bed, and Japan's doing FINE fine. Let's go back to urbanization just for one moment. JP Morgan estimates that if they do a reform of the registration system, that could add potentially to 100 million new urbanized households. That could absolutely move the dial. And finally, mortgage market reform, which is the easy one on the list. And now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, yes, fine, that all sounds great, but that would require a pivot on the behalf of the government. And of course, you would be right for thinking that. And there's lots of commentators that have come out and basically argued that a pivot's not possible. And I'm actually not so sure of that. I looked no further for evidence than what happened during the COVID lockdowns. The minute there was serious social unrest, the government reversed the policy. So make no mistake about it. If President Xi thinks it's in the interest of China to pivot, he will absolutely pivot. Let's slowly draw to a close. In 2019, I published a 50-page paper all about the new Silk Road, the One Belt, One Road initiative, discussing the geopolitical implications of that infrastructure project. I also traveled all around the UK and internationally delivering talks about what's called Thucydides' trap, which is a term that Graham Allison, the US historian, coined to describe the situation where a first world power and a second world power enter into military conflict to vie for that top spot. My abridged conclusion was as follows. President Xi has the opportunity of a lifetime to become the most influential leader of the 21st century and to take back the title of the undeniable hegemon of Asia. But he's going to have to avoid the temptation to avenge humiliation. And what I meant by that was he was just going to have to avoid the temptation to fall into Thucydides' trap, which to date he has, and he deserves credit. I'll refresh that conclusion for 2023. President Xi has the opportunity of a lifetime to sidestep the mistakes that Japan made in the 80s and 90s through careful policy orchestration. And he has huge advantages to play for. He's retaken huge advantage to play for. He can benefit from pulling the lever of urbanization. He benefits from a closed capital account, and of course presides over a command and control economy. But he's going to have to avoid the temptation to seek what I call greater greatness. Because the bottom line is what he's achieved is already great. He's brought 600 million of people out of poverty. He's architected the largest infrastructure project of modern times. He's taken back the title of the undeniable hegemon of Asia. So the question is not whether China has peaked or paused, but whether President Xi feels like he's achieved enough. Because if he decides to reinvest all his chips in the future generation, to promote social harmony, to stabilize then China's next decade, and to promote moderate growth, then China's next decade won't be lost. It'll be unstoppable. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.